Uh, Welcome to the Navigating Charter Challenges podcast, where we explore the significant challenges schools face and how they rise to overcome them. I'm John Carwell, and I've served as the Charter School authorizer for the Delaware Department of Education for nearly 15 years. Today, we're diving into a powerful case study of Crestwood Academy Alternative School in El Segundo, California, and its partnership with the Los Angeles County Office of Education, or LACOE, as the authorizer. Crestwood Academy, a hybrid school model, once struggled with a series of critical issues: chronic absenteeism, a disconnect between the school's model and student needs, and financial instability due to low enrollment and poor participation. It was a trifecta of challenges. If only half of your students are attending school, what does that mean, not just for academic success, but also for data integrity, financial stability, and the overall effectiveness of the educational program? This episode focuses on a critical question. As an authorizer, what do you do in this situation? Do you let the school figure it out on its own, or do you step in to collaborate and drive meaningful change? We'll explore how a cooperative effort between the school leadership and LACOE helped turn things around, laying the groundwork for a brighter future. In this episode, we'll be speaking with Indra Ciccarelli, the authorizer from LACOE. You'll hear about the tough conversations, the difficult decisions, and the strategic interventions implemented to tackle credit recovery and attendance challenges. Together, these two entities work to establish a clear path toward improvement and accountability. The COVID-19 pandemic hit Crestwood Academy particularly hard. While other schools managed to bounce back, Crestwood continued to struggle. Month-over-month attendance data revealed alarming trends, prompting immediate action from both school leadership and LACOE. Stay tuned as we unpack the key moments that helped Crestwood Academy face its challenges head-on. Whether you're a school leader, educator, or someone passionate about education reform, we hope this episode offers valuable insights into how collaboration can lead to real transformation. So let's get started. First, we'll explore the background and challenges that Crestwood Academy was facing before working with LACOE. I want to welcome Indra Ciccarelli with the Los Angeles County Office of Education, or LACOE. Indra, can you start by describing your role as the authorizer for charter schools in the Los Angeles area? What are your primary responsibilities, and how LACOE typically engages with schools that are underperforming, and what role do you play in that process?
Yes, well, thank you, John. Yes, my name's Indra Ciccarelli. I am the director of the Charter Schools Office for Los Angeles County Office of Education. Here in California, my office really has three main jobs that we do. First, we are an appellate body, so we have 79 school districts within the county, and if any of those districts deny a charter school an initial petition or a renewal or anything like that, then they can apply to my office on appeal. Second job is if my board approves any of those schools and overturns that appeal, then we have the direct monitoring and oversight of those schools. And that is sort of the vast majority of schools that we have, that we oversee and support are those schools that have come to us on appeal. There are some small instances where they may come to us directly, whether they want to be a countywide or a direct to county. And in fact, the school we're talking about today did come to us originally as a countywide. So they came directly to us, applying to the county as a countywide. Then the third job we really do is technical support to our other authorizers and districts across the county. In terms of our charter schools and what we directly oversee and monitor, I have a really strong team. Each of my coordinators has a portfolio of schools. Here in California, we have to identify a single point of contact for each of the schools that we oversee. So those coordinators become that single point of contact to provide them resources and help and to review a lot of the submissions and documents that the schools are giving to us on a regular basis. We perform at least 2 site visits a year, and there's probably 100+ documents that they're submitting to us over the course of the year. One of the things we do that may be unusual from other authorizers is we do require all of our schools to record their board meetings and send us those recordings. And so my staff is listening to every single board meeting as well for those schools. So we have a lot of touch points with our schools. Uh, since COVID, during COVID, we actually started meeting with all of our school leaders on a Zoom meeting every 2 weeks. So every 2 weeks, we see our school leaders in that Zoom meeting, and allows us to have another touch point in terms of communication, and hopefully encourages them to communicate with each other as well. When we do see a school that's struggling, typically it starts with that coordinator, that single point of contact, really just sort of reaching out and maybe asking some questions, asking for additional information, um, trying to give them some additional resources, whether it's training opportunities here at the county, or professional development opportunities that they're aware of. Um, if things continue to go badly, they may get to a point where we send a notice of concern to the school. Um, that starts with a notice of concern from my office. It can then be elevated to the point where it's a notice of concern, either from our cabinet or our superintendent. And ultimately, if things continue to go down, then they could end up having a notice of violation that actually comes from our board, and eventually that sort of nuclear option of revocation for a school. So that's sort of uh, a 50,000 uh, mile view of what we do and how we support our schools.
Thanks, Indra. That's really helpful context setting for our conversation. So let's dive into the discussion about Crestwood. So when you first encountered Crestwood Academy, what were the major challenges the school was facing?
Um, I think the first year, so they were first approved and began operation in 2018-19, right before uh, COVID hit. They were approved as a countywide, so they were opening up multiple sites. They were small sites, um, with 50 to 100 kids maybe, and they started off with 2 locations in our county. And after the first year of operation, they did open a third location as well. And so they went into COVID with those 3 locations. I think some of our early concerns with the school, uh, some governance issues in terms of meeting quorum and in terms of following Brown Act. I think some basic operational pieces, um, being able to have their data disaggregated across 3 different sites and make sure that they were actually tracking some of that data. I think was some of our early concerns with the school. But I'd say nothing completely unusual for sort of a new startup school, somebody that's starting. I think there's always some struggles in those first year or two in terms of operations. Um, and so that's sort of where we were in the beginning, I think, with them.
Awesome, thank you. And I can respect the relational intentionality of your office, and especially given the time around COVID and just leaning in and getting to know your schools better. So when it came to your office's assessment of the school and their challenges, how did your office pinpoint the areas that needed the most attention?
Well, I think coming out of COVID is when we really started to see some concerns with the school. Um, I think there were many issues we identified as they came out of COVID. It hit them particularly hard with their enrollment, with their attendance, which had dropped to below 50%. Um, coming out of COVID, they were struggling to get students to take the tests. So I think with only 50% of their students showing up, they were also only testing less than 50% of their students. So we had concerns with their assessment data and how much we could rely on that assessment data. Uh, they had some concerns fiscally. I think they were struggling not only because of enrollment. Here in California, average daily attendance is how they get a majority of their funding. So the 50% attendance rate was also hurting them. They had started, for some of their school sites, they'd started providing some transportation through Hop Skip Drive, so sort of a private organization for transportation for students, and that cost, I think, was a lot more than they were initially expecting, so that was hurting them. So we saw some fiscal issues, we saw some data issues, we saw uh, attendance issues, and so we were seeing a lot of concerns with this school. And we kind of went into triage mode, I think, in terms of what do you do to help this school that's got all of these things happening. And I think for us, that attendance rate really was, I think, the first thing we needed to deal with, right? Like, how do I know that your whether your educational program is working or not if the kids aren't even showing up, right? As an alternative school, that's really their main objective, is to re-engage students who have been disengaged in sort of a traditional school setting. And so clearly they weren't re-engaging those students. We couldn't uh, rely on their academic data and assessments because they weren't testing enough kids because they weren't showing up. They were leaving half of their potential money on the table because the kids weren't showing up. Um, so we really felt like that attendance piece needed to be the first thing. We needed to be able to make sure that the majority of students were showing up every day, so that we could then look at the fidelity of the educational program, look at their assessment data, see if their finances were sustainable. But a lot of that stemmed really from attendance first.
Understood. That's really helpful to hear. So, bring us into the room when you met with school leadership. How did you approach the conversations about the school's need to adjust its model and address these attendance issues that you mentioned?
Yeah, well, and I think it was a growing thing. I think it started with the coordinator really just reaching out and saying, hey, we noticed this attendance is really low. What are your plans? Is this something you're looking at? Are you tracking this? Are you seeing what we're seeing? And do you find this as concerning as we find this? And I think, early responses from the school were yes, they had noticed that too. It was concerning. And so it was something that they potentially were working on to fix. I think when we started asking the school sort of for a specific action plan or what specific actions they were implementing, I think that's where things were maybe not as specific as we would have liked. Um, I think there was a sense of these higher goals. We're going back to our overall school goals and looking at adjusting things. And um, we kept trying to say, like, we want sort of boots on the ground. Like, what are you actually doing to fix this? Um, and you know, both myself and the coordinator that was overseeing the school have experience with alternative schools. And I think, one of the things I've really pushed with all of my staff is that the vast majority of staff have been site administrators, have been school administrators. And so um, they're able to hopefully speak to these charter school leaders with a sense of authority and some knowledge base and say, well, look, I've been there. I've been where you are, and here's what I did that worked. And so I think for both of us, we were kind of like, well, who's the person that's making the phone calls, right? Who's the person that knows these kids? And when the kid doesn't show up, they're making the phone calls. And they didn't really have an answer for that. I think, well, they few people, the counselor, would do it sometimes, the dean would do it sometimes, but they weren't really clear on this is a specific job duty. These are, the times that they're doing it. Uh, and so at first they were giving us, like I said, this plan that really wasn't as specific as we would have liked. And they said, no, we expect to see changes, and we're going to be tracking this to show the data. And I think in the beginning, that's what we were just asking for. Okay, give us an action plan, and then let's see that improves. We didn't see initial improvement. So we got to the point where we were then holding meetings with some of the school leadership, and they decided they were going to start giving us weekly updates, right? Because we really were only seeing that attendance on a month-by-month basis in our official submissions and reports that they give us. And so I think that first year that we were really looking at this, which was probably that first year of 21, 22, sort of coming out of COVID, is when we identified it. I think we started really trying to work with the school a little bit more closely in 2022, 23. But again, in the beginning, we were only seeing those monthly attendance reports and seeing that things weren't improving the way we wanted. And so then we got to a point where we said, okay, give us weekly attendance reports. Let's see what week by week do we see some improvement? What's going on here? And then there seemed to be some disconnect. Like they would give us these weekly reports that looked great. They're like, oh yeah, we're up to 70, 80%, attendance rate. And then we get the monthly report and it would be like 50% again. And we're like, what? Why? What's different? Why are your internal reports saying one thing to you, and then what you're giving to us to actually get paid is totally different? What's happening? Um, and then they started to say, well, they were struggling to figure out how to really track since this was a hybrid program, they were struggling to uh, track the hybrid days. And since it was so much easier for them to track, the in-seat days, the days when the kids were required to be there in seat, that's sort of what they were tracking. And so it became very clear to us, well, the problem is not, this 50% rate, the problem is not your in-seat attendance. The problem is your hybrid attendance. And now you're starting to call into question, is this even the right program? If all your kids are showing up on the days that they're supposed to be in class and they're not showing up and doing the work on those hybrid days, then is hybrid the best for this community? Why are you doing a hybrid program then? Um,
Pause there for a moment, Indra. I'm curious. So, that sounds like a pretty difficult conversation, kind of a wake-up call. So, again, bring us into the room and describe like the reaction by the school leadership when you asked that critical question about the whether the model was a right fit.
Yeah, and I think when we ask that question, I think they react like, no, this, we're doing this for these higher goals, these higher reasons, right? That this is the right fit because these are students that haven't been doing well in a traditional system, that are maybe working, or maybe doing sports, maybe doing something else that doesn't allow them to be at school every day, right? And so this model is something that they believe gives those students those opportunities.
Understood.
Um, but it started to us to look a little deeper into what opportunities they were really giving kids by having this hybrid program. And we started looking at not only the attendance, but now like, let's look at graduation rate. Let's look at these things that we would typically look at for sort of an alternative school like this, right? That is serving students that have been disengaged, that are probably credit deficient. And one of the alternative metrics we had for them was really tracking um, that credit recovery and courses that students were making up. And in starting to look a little deeper into this, we saw that they really were tracking credit recovery very much like a traditional school. We didn't see that students were actually gaining credits any faster than they would at a traditional school. And so then we found out that leadership, that they really hadn't put in place systems that allowed kids to get credits faster.
Mm, interesting.
And that I think was, a hard conversation to have with them of like, are you really a traditional school that just has a couple remote days?
Mm,
Or are you an alternative school that is providing options, a variety of options different from a traditional school? And so they actually, it forced them to go back and look at um, some of their policies in terms of credit recovery and in terms of credit attainment, and figuring out ways that, yes, if you've got these kids working online, they theoretically they should be able to move through the work faster, right? And that may be part of why you're not getting the work on these hybrid days as you would like, because what's the incentive? It's
mhm.
not like if I work extra hard on those hybrid days, I'm going to make up credits faster, right? And that should be your bread and butter for an alternative school, right? That's what you're pushing on the kids. Well, you work hard, you come to us, you do this work, you're going to get your credits faster than everybody else and catch up and graduate on time. But they weren't really offering that incentive to these students. So you're saying, well, what's the incentive to do that work on those remote days if it's not going to get me anything more than I would get at a traditional school? And
That makes
so, yeah.
so. Is this interaction that you and your team had with Crestwood, is it indicative of your office's monitoring process, or are there some, I guess, for lack of a better term, customizations that you made to monitoring Crestwood?
I think it is typical of what we would see for a school that gets to a certain point, right? Sort of a multi-tiered system of support, right? You've got that um, sort of moving up in tiers as far as the problem goes. Uh, with, I'd say, a lot of our schools, when we see concerns or issues, that initial step of just sort of working with their coordinator through emails or doing a site visit will typically move them in the right direction. We'll give them the nudge they need to self-correct. Um, if that doesn't work, then that initial notice of concern is enough, and they'll fix the concerns we note within that notice of concern, and it sort of ends there. Um, when it doesn't end there, and we see those problems continue, that's when we'll start to hold a meeting, like an in-person, or not in person, sorry. We'll start to hold a meeting with their school leadership. And if one or two meetings with school leadership doesn't affect change, then it may be elevated to the point where we have a meeting that we request several of their board members to attend. And so now we'll have a meeting with their school leadership and the board members to try to make sure that their entire school community is aware of what's going on. And especially you know, their board, who is the ultimate authority. and try to put some pressure on them. That is not something that happens often. It is something that happens though. I would say, we have one of those meetings every couple of years with one of our schools. We have 20 to 30 schools, depending on the year that you're looking at. And I'd say, yeah, we probably have one of those meetings with actual board members because of an identified problem. And once every couple of years. So we did get to that point with this particular school.
You read my mind. I was going to ask the case for Crestwood. So tell us about what was I guess the final straw, for lack of a better word, that led your office to do that rare step that doesn't happen very often. So help us understand how it led to that and what were the results.
So, to their credit, they did adjust their policies for credit recovery. We were hoping that would provide more of an incentive for kids to show up on those hybrid days. We didn't necessarily see that. We had identified that disconnect between the data they were collecting, hybrid versus in-person days, versus what they were submitting for funding. So they started really, hopefully, collecting the data correctly and giving us updates. We weren't seeing that their action plan was leading to really any substantive increase in attendance. So we met with leadership a couple times and tried to get pretty pointed. At one point I finally just said, no, like I want to know, who have you hired to make phone calls in the morning to students that have not logged in, have not done their work? Who's the person that is going to know, well, this kid gets off at work at 2 o'clock. So I'm going to call him at 2 o'clock when he gets off of work and say, hey, can you log in and start doing your work and start doing something? Like, who's that person who knows that and is making those calls? And I even try to give them that idea of like, it's going to pay for itself, right? If you're making, you know, $40-$50 a day per kid, right? How much are you paying this person per hour to just make phone calls, right? If they bring a few kids every day that wouldn't have otherwise logged in, like they're gonna pay for themselves, right? They don't have to get a whole lot of kids to pay for themselves. This should be an easy thing, right? Get this person, make the phone calls. We didn't see the increase in attendance. We had one of those meetings. We said, oh, well, we had somebody, but then they didn't, they weren't doing it like as well as we thought we wanted them to. And so they've quit. And now we're getting another person. And it just seemed like it was we weren't getting the results. And I didn't get that sense of urgency from them, right? Like, this is urgent, right? And I'd finally gotten to the point where I told them, if you were to be renewed, if you were going up for renewal right now, I would have no argument. I would have to recommend denial. Your kids are only showing up half the time. Why are you a school, right? The kids aren't even showing up to your school. I have no argument. I
Understood.
can't rely on any of your assessment data. I can't point to strong finances. There's no reason for me to say that you should be renewed. And if I don't see a strong change in attendance, like starting now and moving through all of next year, then when we get to renewal, I don't know where we're at. And so we did finally get to that point of like, okay, we need to call in your board. I need to have this meeting with all of your leadership and your board members, and let's see where you're at. And so we had that meeting. One of their school leaders started to bring up, I said, okay, what are you doing? They started to pull up a PowerPoint presentation to try to show us this whole, and I said, no, I'm just going to stop you right there. I don't want a PowerPoint presentation. Who did you hire? Who's making phone calls? And how many phone calls did they make yesterday? That's what I want to know. I don't need a PowerPoint presentation. Um, and so I think that meeting with the board was sort of a turnaround moment for them.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think the board member maybe was paying more attention, and she was kind of like, yeah, what I'm hearing you say is like, we just need to hire somebody. And I was, yes, this is what I've been saying for a long time. And so she started brainstorming, and she asked the school leadership, she's like, well, why, if we're just talking somebody to just hire on an hourly basis to make phone calls, like, why don't we get one of our alumni, right? To make those phone calls, right? Some of our alumni are probably looking for work, and they know the kids, and they know, right? They can speak to having to do this work, and let's hire some of our alumni to do this. And I really think that was a turnaround moment, because we started to finally see that uptick in attendance after that. They were able to say, yes, we've hired this alumni, this person, they're making phone calls every day. And we finally started to see an uptick in attendance. And I would say this year now, they have made it into the mid 70s in terms of their attendance rate, which is a huge improvement to go from below 50% to mid 70s. That's some good growth. And it's probably not exactly where I'd like to be. I think if you're a well-run alternative school, you should probably be in the 80s somewhere. But that's huge for them, and to gain another 25% of your budget back.
Yes.
To And I'd say it also gives them, they've also gotten a lot better at their testing, right? So that was the other big push. We said, okay, when you're doing your testing, we want to see that you're testing all of your students.
Awesome. Awesome. I'm so glad for the school and for the work and partnership and collaboration between the school and your office. A consistent theme that I'm hearing is, for lack of a better term, critical thought partner, that's based upon, a relationship. So, like as I mentioned earlier, your office has been very intentional about um, that relationship and kind of leaning in on that. So I'm curious, as you reflect on the improvement and the success with Crestwood, as you look back over the process, what do you think worked well, and where do you think there could have been some improvements?
I think what worked well was those conversations, those face-to-face conversations,
Mhm.
right? Once we got to that point where we were meeting with them face-to-face as a group, I think that helped to start move move things along. And obviously, once we got the board member involved, that I think made the big difference. I think what we potentially could have done better is maybe identifying some of these problems a little bit quicker. I think it was tough sometimes because there's that lag in data. We don't necessarily see things till
Mhm.
after the fact. So I think identifying these things a little bit quicker might have helped. I think it's tough sometimes as the authorizer. One of my coordinators, one of his sort of well-known lines within our office is, autonomy is a big word, right? And these charter schools, right, they have autonomy, and that's a big word. So, we can point out sometimes the problems, we can give you our advice, but we can't force you to take our advice. We can't go in and run your school for you.
Mhm.
That's not our mandate, that's not our job, but We're here to support. We're here to give you advice. We're here to try to give you resources, and hopefully you can take that and run with it. But I think, with this school, there was a disconnect, I think in those early conversations where, um, we thought we were being pretty clear in terms of what we think they needed to do. But somehow, uh, the school wasn't necessarily hearing us. I think of some of that original when we asked, well, just start tracking your data. And that disconnect between what they were giving us in their weekly reports and then what they were submitting as their monthly reports, were like, that's a huge difference. You're telling us 70, 80%, and then the monthly reports are saying 50% still. Like what, and for them to just be like, oh, well, it was easier to do the in-person seats. We're like, but that's not the problem. Like, we're trying to help you solve the problem, and you're just deciding to collect some other data that's not going to even help you move the needle. Like, there was definitely this disconnect there. And I'm not sure how we could have gotten past that disconnect faster, but if there had been a way for us to sort of identify that and push past that faster, I think it would have been good. Um, but yeah, like I said, getting the board member involved, she seemed to be the one that was able to push past some of that disconnect and um, get them to the point to the place we needed them to get to. And maybe it was that board member really had more of a sense of urgency than some of the school leadership. Um, but so yeah, the board meeting went well, but would have liked to see some of that uh, would have been like to have been able to identify some of the concerns faster or get past some of that uh, miscommunication or disconnect faster.
Understood. That's really helpful. And as you think about key lessons that you've taken away from that experience that could help other authorizers working with struggling schools, and I would say even specifically to new authorizers who are just kind of starting out in this work, what key lessons would you share with our authorizing community?
I mean, definitely getting the board involved, right? Like I said, getting that board member involved is really what I think made the big difference. And I think we've started in general, as an authorizing team, started working on bringing our boards in earlier and having more communication directly with our boards. I think, in the past, we had a tendency to work a lot really closely with school leadership. And a lot of our communication was with school leadership. And we really only had a few touch points of direct communication with the board. And I think we've really tried to work on that and improve that and um, have more direct communication with their board earlier and more often.
Understood. And lastly, when you think about your office's, I guess, values and standards for quality, what were some of like your guiding principles in working with this school? But overall, as you work with your portfolio, what what are the guiding values that kind of keep your eye on true north, so to speak?
We're student centered. I think, it's really always the student at the center. What's best for kids, and secondly, what's best for this community, right? And so, when I look at a school that is struggling, you know, could we just heavy-handed right away start trying to shut them down? I mean, I guess we could, but that that's going to be a long process, right? Here in California, it's not something that's going to happen quickly. Um, and is that what's in the best interest of those kids in that community, right? If it takes me a year or two to shut a school down, that's a year or two those kids are never going to get back. Versus if I can get that school to actually do well for those students that they have right now and serve those kids properly, then that's something that's going to potentially change their lives um, for the better. So I think that's sort of our true north. I think all of us, like I said, on my team, we're all educators. We all came from school sites, came from being a teacher, and so you know we want to see positive outcomes for kids. And so when I see a struggling school, that's not positive outcomes for kids. And so how do we change that to make sure that there are positive outcomes for kids? And yes, sometimes you're working with them and it gets to a point where you're saying this school shouldn't exist because they're unable to provide those positive outcomes for kids. But um, but that's always a really difficult decision to make, and it's always something that is going to take time. And so, in the meantime, in the interim, what can we do to try to improve those outcomes for kids? Even if I am going to be ultimately working towards shutting a school down, I want to make sure that those kids had every opportunity possible.
Absolutely. That is really helpful to hear. And is there anything else, Indra, that you'd like to share with our audience, perhaps that I haven't asked you about? Any other final closing thoughts?
I think, one of the sort of secondary things with this school that we've worked with them, we touched a lot upon the attendance pieces. Um, we talked a little bit about sort of, is this the right program for this community? And I think that, that's a secondary conversation we have with them of really adjusting their program um, to meet the needs of the kids. And I think that was something that they struggled with as well. It took them, they didn't do that that change in credit recovery until what, year 4 of operation for them. Um, so I think they somewhat struggled to adjust to the needs of their community. And I do see that with schools sometimes where they'll come in and they've got in mind what they think their students are going to be or what they think their students need. And then they open the school and they realize, oh, we're getting some different, these aren't the kids we thought we were going to get, or these kids need something different than what we thought they needed.
Sure.
And the well-run schools, the good schools are able to adjust to that and able to adjust to that quickly. Um, and I think this school struggled to do that, right? Struggled to see that, you're offering these remote days, but these kids need maybe more handholding for those remote days. They need somebody who's going to call them, who's going to make them beholden to logging in and doing the work. Yeah, I think they struggled to sort of adjust to market needs, right? And so I think that's a secondary piece with this as well that I see across the board with startup charters is, can you adjust to those market needs? Um, and like I said, I think you know, they're improving now, right? We're seeing that improvement. I think their attendance is up. They're testing their kids. Um, I think they're adjusting, but it was a slower process than I would have liked. Um, and so yeah, I'd say that if I was going to say, what's another thing, that would be this sort of secondary thing of, attendance first, but then also just a higher idea of, are you adjusting to market needs? Are you adjusting to the kids you're actually getting and the needs of the kids you actually have as opposed to the kids that you thought you would have.
Understood. That's really helpful. Well, I want to commend you and your team for the successes that you supported and collaborated with the school to realize, to get on a better path. First and foremost with attendance, because students are not in school, they can't learn, but also to get, tweaking parts of their model that weren't actually uh, realizing the outcomes that they intended when they were approved for the charter. So I think specifically the relational side of what you and your team do, while respecting the big A, the autonomy piece, which I believe you've successfully navigated and helped to set the school up for success, as opposed to you could have an approach. Some authorizers have the approach where they totally stand back and give um, full autonomy with really little to no involvement. But I think because you and your team stepped in, I think the school's in a better place because of that involvement in those relationships. So thank you for your time, Indra. This has been a great conversation. Learned a lot. I'm sure that our audience will learn a lot from this, particularly new authorizers. So thank you again. And for our podcast community, we look forward to engaging with you again on other topics like this. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think to your point, there's that idea of, do you give them enough rope to hang themselves, right? There's that saying, but back to our idea of like it's student-centered, like that school isn't just hanging themselves, right? They're hurting kids.
Sure.
So I don't want to give them enough leeway that they're hurting kids because they're not just hurting themselves.
Indeed. Like I think I've heard this term years ago called bounded autonomy.
I like that.
Hmm.
Yeah.
I think that's a wrap. Thank you, Indra.